All right, super. Well, I'm glad to see all of you, and thank you to each of our speakers in our breakout sessions. It's been a fabulous day. I know you're tired. You're probably ready to go, get some dinner, and get on with your evening. So thank you for taking the time to be here, to stay, to tune in for this final segment. We heard a marvelous talk this morning, giving us a historical background of humanism and the humanities and some very clear distinctions. And then later, from a philosophical perspective, being able to look at Christian humanism as a kind of vitalism, a liveliness, and then also we got to see it in some ways embodied in the way it is taught in the university, and seeing the transcendent brought through a common grace kind of interaction that was quite marvelous in Marilyn's talk on Shakespeare. So what I hope to do is to kind of piggyback off of what Josh brought last night, if you were there at Bayo's, and then throughout the day, and maybe in some ways sort of wrap this up for us in some sort of cohesive call to recovery. And so the title of my talk this afternoon is Education, Culture, and Human Flourishing, Recovering Christian Humanism for a Post-Christian Culture. And I want to begin by talking about a famous interview, or maybe some of you saw it, where Richard Dawkins, the atheistic biologist, joined Rachel Johnson of the LBC last year during an Easter talk to reflect on the role of Christianity in British life. And in this interview, Johnson asked Dawkins what he thought of the statistics that showed a dramatic decline in the number of people in Britain who professed Christianity and attended church. And this is Dawkins' answer. This is how he replied. He said, "I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there is a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense, and it's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter, certainly, if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful. If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I choose Christianity every single time. I mean, it seems to me to be fundamentally a decent religion in a way that I think Islam is not." Now, Richard Dawkins' self-identification as a cultural Christian illustrates the deep incoherence at the heart of secular humanism. While he celebrates the architectural grandeur of the cathedrals, the moral sensibility of the Christian ethos, and the aesthetic comfort of the traditional Christian hymns and carols, he simultaneously disavows the theological soil from which these cultural expressions have sprang up. Dawkins wants the fruit of Christian civilization without the faith that nourished that fruit. And in short, he wants the bloom without the root. And this is a form of cut flower humanism, the attempt to preserve beauty, order, and meaning that makes life in the West desirable while discarding a transcendent source that made them possible. And just as a severed flower withers when it's detached from its roots, so too does the culture decay when it's stripped of its religious vision that gave it coherence and vitality. Secular humanism, as articulated, for example, in all three iterations of the Humanist Manifesto, presents itself as a comprehensive, progressive philosophy that explicitly rejects Christianity and all other forms of religion or supernaturalism. It asserts that the universe is self-existing and not created. It denies the need for a creator or divine revelation. Traditional theism, particularly belief in a personal God, the immortality of the soul, and divine judgment, is dismissed as unprovable, outdated, and ultimately harmful to human flourishing. Instead of beginning with a creator, secular humanism begins with the autonomous man, autonomous humanity. It asserts that the moral responsibility, meaning, and progress are grounded solely in human reason, scientific inquiry, and self-determination. In other words, man is not in the middle of all things, as the Renaissance humanists would affirm. Rather, in a way that Protagoras never certainly meant, the secular humanist believes that man is indeed the measure of all things. In short, secular humanism, by insisting on moral and aesthetic goods apart from a divine reality, demands an inheritance that it refuses to steward. Dawkins' selective reverence for Christianity's cultural remnants exposes this contradiction. He desires the lingering fragrance of a worldview his own philosophy seeks to uproot. And so this afternoon, I want to submit that in the twilight of Christendom, the postmodern critique of secularism, even though this movement itself is born of some of the most radical skeptics, it has ironically reopened the path to recovering Christian humanism in our day. Postmodern thought, by acknowledging the interpretive nature of knowing, has exposed secularism's conceit, the erroneous belief that pure reason is neutral, universal, and self-sufficient. Further, postmodernism has positioned the conversation such that Christianity deserves to receive a full consideration of its purchase on human flourishing. In fact, the very crisis Western culture faces today, a crisis of meaning, identity, and institutional coherence, is a direct result of the loss of our religious foundations. Just this week, the president of Pepperdine University, Jim Gash, highlighted this very point in an op-ed in the U.S. News and World Report. He uses the metaphor of the tetherball to demonstrate how belief in God actually affords more academic freedom to pursue what is good, true, and beautiful. Gash posits that, quote, because the ball is tethered to a pole, you can hit it back and forth with complete freedom and intensity, knowing that it will always orbit back to the pole. In a similar way, when our approach to academic freedom is tethered to our belief in God as the source of truth, we can explore ideas and grapple with even the most difficult topics. My case is that Christian humanism offers the most compelling vision for restoring human dignity, reanimating education, renewing cultural coherence, and fostering true human flourishing. By recovering a Christian humanism for our age, we can exchange the barren ground of Eliot's anthropocentric idealism for the rich soil of incarnational humanism. In other words, we can have what the Renaissance had in exchange for Eliot's wasteland. And I want to talk about this, if we have time, in 5 movements. And depending on the time and how long it takes me to get through this, I want to talk about the crisis of secularism and the postmodern reveal. I'd like to talk about Christian humanism in the public square and the halls of academia. I'd like to talk about a definition, or at least get us toward a better definition of Christian humanism in the history of the West, and then close with some features of Christian humanism. So let's begin by talking about the crisis of secularism and the postmodern reveal. Western culture's current and profound crisis of identity and purpose is not new. It's been trending for at least the past 100 years. Arguably, we've witnessed our crisis reach an apex in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and in the U.S. particularly with the most recent election. As an aside, it's interesting to note that these sorts of crises always seem to flush themselves out in the political arena, that final outlet in the drain of cultural sewage. My point being that beneath the vitriolic political arena, we've all felt the seismic cultural tremors over the last 5 years, and in some particular ways, things have come to a head. And I doubt that this is the apex, but it is a notable pinnacle in the mountain range of culture, which means we have an opportunity to restore Christian humanism. But I want to repeat, this isn't the beginning of our cultural crisis, and we could fill libraries with books arguing for numerous historical instances where the consequences of ideas have been felt and call those the beginning. Was it the fall of Rome? Was it Aquinas' baptism of Aristotle? Occam's nominalism? The secularism of the Renaissance, or certain segments of the Renaissance? The solipsism of Descartes, or the skepticism of Kant and Hume, or the transvaluation of Nietzsche? All of these ideas have played significant roles in the great conversation of the West, but I'm not convinced any of these were the sole creator of our postmodern cultural crisis. Stanford professor Mark Greif has noticed that between the years of 1933 and 1973, the West reached a similar cultural crisis over the nature of man. Between those years, more books, fiction and nonfiction, were published that asked some version of the perennial question, what is man? And more books on that were published than any other single topic during that period. And rightly so, given that Britain's National Peace Council published a journal in the spring of 1914 that announced that the West was so technologically and socially advanced that war was now anachronistic, and it was virtually impossible. This example is a case in point illustrating the fanatical optimism of the autonomous modern man. Because we all know in hindsight, by the end of the summer, the West launched its most advanced genocidal attack on humanity in all of human history, unleashing 2 world wars that were responsible for an estimated 100 million souls who lost their lives at the end of a gun barrel or in a gas chamber. The 20th century bore witness to a cataclysmic failure of both Enlightenment optimism and technological progressivism that resulted in the postmodern response. Among those of that period who addressed this crisis of man was C.S. Lewis, whose lectures on the subject became his beloved book, The Abolition of Man. In a lecture, a different lecture that Lewis gave on the reception of his chair at Cambridge, a lecture titled De Descriptione Temporum, Lewis argues that the most profound shift in the Western world took place not at the fall of Rome or even at the Renaissance, but sometime between Walter Scott and Jane Austen. This threshold marks the period in history in which modern man is decidedly less like his pre-Christian and Christian ancestors than either of them were unlike each other. To say this another way, Lewis argued that the pagan and the Christian were more like each other in that either of them, or that either of them were like the modern post-Christian man. Something radical happened. The modern man is deluded, argues Lewis, like a woman who tries to regain her virginity by seeking a divorce. Just like her, modern man is now doubly cut off from his maiden state. He has no natural conception of and no taste for transcendence. Jens Zimmerman says that modern man has lost the ability to answer the fundamental questions of who we are and what we are here for. And this is due to our unmooring from religious sources and human dignity. We are witnessing, he says, the exhaustion of secular reason. Some examples: modern scientific inquiry, though powerful in its own domain, offers little help in addressing the existential questions. The secular university described by Jean Billard is a spiraling cadaver. It's in ruins, non-functional in the social arenas of the market and employment, lacking cultural substance or an end purpose of knowledge. Liberal democracy, stripped of its moral underpinnings, is faltering under the weight of technocratic reductionism. Ironically, it's the non-Christian, postmodern philosophers, especially Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Heidegger, that have helped to dismantle the myth of Enlightenment objectivity. These thinkers have exposed the reason is never neutral or universal, but always conditioned by tradition, perspective, and power. Nietzsche ridiculed the veneration of abstract reason. Marx unveiled the ideological function. Freud uncovered the unconscious forces beneath their self-perception, or our self-perception, and Heidegger redefined truth as hermeneutical or interpretive and not objective. Michael Polanyi built upon this insight and demonstrated that even science depends on imagination, tradition, and belief in a rational cosmos. Emmanuel Levinas expands on these insights and contends that ethics actually arises before cognition in a primordial rupture of responsibility given by the other. He calls this that face-to-face interaction that we have, that it's precognitive. In other words, hilarity is itself a precognitive moral call. All of these critiques converged, and the Enlightenment dream of autonomous man collapsed. Jean-François Lyotard, his rejection of meta-narratives and Foucault's analysis of power further revealed that secularism is not a neutral arena. It's a civil religion with its own dogmas and exclusions. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel has demonstrated convincingly that the materialist conception of nature is almost certainly false and cannot be maintained in light of current scholarship. In sum, postmodernism has rendered secularism implausible. It's shown that the concept of pure reason, it has shown that the concept of pure reason secularism has exalted is historically contingent, interpretive, and unable to ground meaning, morality, or community. And so with that, this explosion of secularism, I move to my second point here, that this explosion or implosion of secularism has created a vacuum. And it's into that vacuum that Christian humanism can speak with renewed vigor. It offers something more than nostalgia or fundamentalism. It proposes a reanimated vision for human flourishing, and as Zimmerman argues, Christianity is not the enemy of secularity rightly understood. It's the foundation of it. Christian humanism affirms the shared public space of the saeculum, the dignity of all persons, and the call to love neighbor and cultivate creation. And so thus I propose 4 reasons the humanism of Christianity needs to be given the public consideration it deserves. The first reason is because it retrieves a fuller hermeneutic understanding of truth rooted in tradition and transcendence. I'll say that one more time in case you're writing this down. Because it retrieves the fuller hermeneutic understanding of truth rooted in tradition and transcendence. Secondly, because it retrieves a liberal arts and humanities education animated by the incarnation. One that forms and transforms the soul and doesn't simply train consumers and cogs for the modern workforce. Thirdly, because it retrieves a political vision grounded in natural law, secularity, and the common good of all human beings. And fourthly, because it retrieves a renewed moral imagination capable of resisting technocratic and other ideological reductionisms. Christian humanism invites us to think with the whole soul, to recover what T.S. Eliot called our heritage of Christian culture, and to labor through education, culture, and even worship for a society that reflects beauty, order, and dignity. What Eliot says of Europe is true of America and the West in general. He says it is against a backdrop of Christianity that all our thought has significance. Even if a European individual does not adhere to Christianity, what he says and makes and does will all spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning. In a fragmented age, an age fragmented by rootlessness, Christian humanism reestablishes roots in a reality that is both real and dignifying of the human being. And so in my third movement, I would like to talk about a definition of Christian humanism. What do I mean when I'm speaking of a Christian humanism? Defining the term Christian humanism can be fairly elusive for a number of reasons, and mainly because humanism's taken on numerous definitions throughout history, but also because the most common belief today by both Christians and secularists is that Christianity and humanism are mutually exclusive. Further, there's been some strange fire offered on the altar of Christian humanism's meaning. For example, there's various theological liberals like Anthony Freeman and Shelby Spong that have sought to claim the expression for their own personal interpretive framework, one which is arguably neither Christian nor humanist. The expression Christian humanism, of course, was first coined in the 19th century by the German philosopher Friedrich Niethammer. He coined this in an 1808 work in which he referred to the Renaissance humanists as Christian humanists, and his work sought to distinguish between 2 competing educational paradigms of the time. Philanthropianism, which emphasized utilitarian and practical education based on Enlightenment rationalism, and humanism. In his usage, this referred to the classical tradition of the holistic formative education rooted in the liberal arts. Niethammer advocated for a Christian humanism that harmonized the classical educational ideals of moral and intellectual formation with Christian theological convictions. And his formulation laid the groundwork for later thinkers that some of you may have heard of: John Henry Newman, or Jacques Maritain, or Etienne Gilson, who articulated fuller visions of Christian humanism in response to modernity's crisis. And so I want to acknowledge that the need here for qualifications abound. And we don't have time to unpack all of them, and so my definitions and explanations may raise a few more questions than they answer, but I want to say that Christian humanism, or the Christian humanism for which I'm advocating, can be understood most simply as a synthesis of non-sectarian Christian theology and classical humanism. While the expression as it was coined originally pointed to the Renaissance humanists Jens Zimmermann and numerous other scholars, Virgil Nimoyanu, William Franklin, Joseph Shaw, Richard Francis, and even more contemporary scholars like Lee Oser, Brad Berzer, and Alan Jacobs all posit that while perhaps not in name, most certainly in substance, Christian humanism not only predates secular atheistic humanism, but has existed since Christianity itself. And even before the Incarnation, it did exist in inchoate forms. Inchoate humanism sprang from two fountains, Greek idealism and Christianity, and they merged in the ancient world. And although they were fundamentally different in dogma, they coexisted in relative harmony because they both understood human beings as having a preeminent place in the universe, distinct from and above the non-human natural world. In the first century, Christianity absorbed and synthesized the religious outlook of the Hebrew people and the philosophical outlook of classical antiquity, those whose idealism set a high value on human reason. Essentially, Christianity animated Greek idealism when God took on human form in the Incarnation, and this became good news for all humanity. William Franklin and Joseph Shaw, in their work, The Case for Christian Humanism, asserts that at the heart of Christian humanism stands the incarnation of the divine word in living historical actuality of Jesus. The clear gospel basis for this statement is John 1:14, and that the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen His glory. Christian humanism acknowledges that even though not all human beings are Christians, all human beings are created imago Dei. All human beings possess common grace. All human beings are therefore creatures of immense worth, dignity, reason, and responsibility. In this sense, Christian humanism is not man-centered, but incarnationally centered. That is, the incarnation affirms the dignity of humanity and God's loving kindness toward mankind. And while man is not the measure of all things, he is in the middle of all things, higher than the beasts and a little lower than the angels. Additionally, Christian humanism acknowledges that Christ is the ideal human. He is the ultimate tyrannizing image, to borrow from David Hicks. In Christ, we recover the fullness of our humanity. Therefore, Christian humanism seeks to recover and restore a vision of human flourishing under the lordship of Christ, integrating faith, reason, and the moral imagination. Finally, rooted in the tradition of thinkers like St. Augustine, Boethius, Dante, Erasmus, and even C.S. Lewis, thinkers who saw the truth, goodness, and beauty cohere in Christ, but are accessible through a disciplined and grace-informed intellect, Christian humanism is not sectarian, nor does it hold a vision of Christian dominionism that is spiritually or politically coercive. It is a gracious and ironic tradition that seeks the peace and welfare of the city of man with an eye toward the common good of all. As such, Christian humanism cherishes education, culture, civic life, and the moral formation, all as arenas of redemptive participation. It further holds that rational inquiry, artistic expression, and civic virtue are not merely human endeavors, they're divine callings. And to paraphrase Jacques Maritain, Christian humanism is the complete humanism. In my fourth movement, I want to just mention here briefly Christian humanism in the history of the West, to kind of give you a very brief overview of the way it may have looked from the beginning. So as I previously explained, Christian humanism has deep roots in the Western tradition. The patristic theologians like Justin Martyr and St. Augustine integrated classical learning with Christian doctrine. Clement of Alexandria and Origen and later even Basil viewed Greek philosophy as a preparation for the gospel. And in the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas harmonized Aristotelian thought with Christian theology, asserting that grace perfects nature. During the Renaissance, Christian humanism blossomed in the works of Erasmus, More, Vergerio, Bruni, and even those that some might consider to be more on the secular fringe like Pico della Mirandola. They championed the humanities and liberal learning as essential to moral and spiritual formation, believing that education was a means of cultivating wisdom and virtue in society's civic leaders. The Protestant reformers, especially Martin Luther and John Calvin, reaffirmed the sanctity of all vocations and emphasized the dignity of the layperson in the saeculum. In the modern period, thinkers like Maritain, C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, Russell Kirk all preserved and defended the Christian humanist vision against the encroachments of scientism, relativism, and nihilism. Adding to their work, we might include the efforts of modern institutions such as the imaginative conservative or First Things. These all stand as a bulwark against the erosion of humane learning. And so what are then the features of Christian humanism for which I'm advocating? In other places, I've written about this more extensively, but for our purposes this afternoon, I'd like to just summarize the features as follows. In the first place, it's the incarnation. The first feature is the incarnational principle. The union of the divine and the human in Christ affirms the goodness of the created order and the legitimacy of human culture. I love that Irenaeus says that the glory of God is a living man. The imago Dei, secondly, every human being bears the image of God and therefore possesses inherent dignity and worth, rational capacity, and moral responsibility. The third feature of the Christian humanism for which I'm advocating is the integration of faith and reason. Christian humanism rejects both fideism and pure rationalism. It embraces a reason informed by faith and a faith seeking understanding. Thus, it absolutely rejects fundamentalism, whether religious or secular. The fourth feature is a moral order. It asserts an objective moral law grounded in divine justice and love. Natural law rooted in and derived from eternal law. The fifth feature is a cultural stewardship. Christian humanists are called to cultivate the world, to pursue the arts, sciences, politics, and education as inherently legitimate vocations under God. Sixth, language and letters. Since language is an essential component of the divine order, a conceptual bridge for conveying divine truth in human thought, letters, conceived in the broadest sense, literature or text, are the essential building blocks of every civilized culture and society, thus ad fontes. And seventh, an optimistic eschatology. While acknowledging the fallenness of the world, Christian humanism is animated by hope in the renewal of all things through Christ. Christian humanists are not by any means fatalists. Richard Dawkins wants the cathedrals without the creeds. He wants the resonance of the hymns without the incarnation. But the future of Western culture cannot be secured by aesthetic sentimentality, and it can't be recovered by civilizational inertia, which has already outrun its original Christian vitality. It must be rooted anew in the transcendent, in the good, the true, and the beautiful, as revealed in the incarnation of Christ. The recovery of Christian humanism is not an attempt to retreat into the past. It's not even the noble work of Christian evangelization per se. It is the replanting of perennial wisdom in a post-Christian soil. It's an invitation to consider the logos beneath the liturgy, the word behind the wisdom, the incarnate truth that dignifies all learning and all labor. It's an invitation to cultivate a world where education forms the whole person, where the cultural conversation fosters meaning and reverence for the permanent things, where flourishing is measured not by self-assertion, but by love of God and neighbor. The future of human flourishing doesn't depend on our technological progress or our ingenuity. It depends on our willingness to be rooted once more in the transcendent source of our humanity. And my hope is that you will join me in becoming the planters and the gardeners of such a future. Thank you very much.